Richard Blackwell froze in the doorway of his daughter's nursery. The woman kneeling beside the crib, her golden hair catching the afternoon light, was singing the exact melody that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. The same lullaby his wife Catherine used to hum every night before cancer stole her voice forever. The maid's voice trembled with the same tenderness, the same love, and Richard felt his carefully constructed walls crumble as tears streamed down. His face, oh. Before we continue, if you enjoy deeply emotional stories about love, loss, and unexpected connections, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. 3 hours earlier, Richard had been drowning in spreadsheets and quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on his office door. Margaret Evans, a woman in her early 30s with striking green eyes and an air of quiet confidence, had been working as his household staff for only 2 weeks. She stood in his doorway, holding his 18-month-old daughter Emma, who was crying inconsolably. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm sorry to disturb you, but Emma won't stop crying. The nanny called in sick, and I've tried everything," Margaret said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. Richard looked up from his computer screen, irritation flashing across his features. He'd specifically hired Margaret to handle housekeeping duties, not childcare. The woman came highly recommended, though her references were sparse. She'd appeared at his door exactly when he needed help most, after his previous housekeeper quit, without notice. "I don't pay you to babysit," he said curtly, not looking up from his work. "Figure it out." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Of course, sir. I was simply hoping you might want to spend some time with your daughter." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Richard finally looked up, taking in the sight of his daughter's red, tear-streaked face and Margaret's disapproving expression. Emma reached tiny arms toward him, but he remained frozen in his chair. "I have work to do?" he said finally, his voice hollow. Margaret studied him for a long moment, and Richard felt uncomfortably exposed under her gaze. There was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding that made him want to look away. "Very well," she said softly. "I'll take care of her." As they left his office, Richard caught a glimpse of Margaret pressing her lips to Emma's forehead, whispering something soothing. The gesture was so natural, so maternal, that it sent an unexpected pang through his chest. Richard Blackwell hadn't always been this cold. 3 years ago, he'd been a different man entirely. He and Catherine had built their empire together, transforming a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation. More importantly, they'd built a life filled with laughter, dreams, and endless possibilities. Catherine had this way of making their sterile mansion feel like a home, filling every room with warmth and music. She sang constantly, in the shower, while cooking breakfast, during late-night walks through their garden. Her voice had been Richard's anchor, the soundtrack to their perfect life. Even when pregnancy made her tired and sick, she sang to her growing belly, creating an invisible bond with their unborn child. The cancer diagnosis came when Emma was 6 months old. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, the doctor said with that practiced gentleness that somehow made everything worse. 6 months to live, maybe 8, if they were lucky. Catherine faced death the same way she'd faced everything else, with grace, courage, and song. Even when the chemotherapy ravaged her body, even when speaking became difficult, she continued humming that lullaby to Emma every night. It was a melody she'd created herself, weaving together fragments of classical pieces into something entirely new, something uniquely theirs. "Promise me," she'd whispered during her final week, her once vibrant voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll sing to her." Richard had nodded, holding her skeletal hand while tears fell like rain, but he'd never kept that promise. The first time he'd tried, alone in Emma's nursery 3 days after the funeral, his voice had cracked on the opening notes. The melody was too tied to Catherine, too painful to bear, so he'd hired nannies instead, a succession of capable women, who fed and bathed and cared for Emma while he buried himself in work. Work became his salvation and his prison. 18-hour days, endless meetings, acquisition deals that required his full attention. He told himself he was building something for Emma's future, but deep down he knew the truth. Work was simply easier than feeling, easier than facing the gaping hole Catherine had left behind. Now, walking through his house in the late afternoon, Richard felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. He'd barely spoken to Emma all week, barely acknowledged her existence beyond ensuring she had proper care. Margaret had seamlessly taken over from the sick nanny, handling everything with quiet efficiency. He'd noticed things about Margaret that he tried to ignore, the way she hummed while she worked, the gentle patience she showed with Emma, the books of poetry he'd glimpsed in her small staff room. She was beautiful, in an understated way, with golden hair that caught the light and eyes that seemed to see too much. But Richard had learned to keep his distance from beauty, from anything that might threaten the careful numbness he'd cultivated. As he approached the nursery, he heard it, a voice, soft and melodic, singing a tune that made his blood freeze in his veins. He moved closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. Margaret knelt beside Emma's crib, her back to the door, completely absorbed in the moment. Emma lay still for the first time all day, her tiny fist wrapped around Margaret's finger, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. And Margaret was singing Catherine's lullaby, note for perfect note, as if she'd known it her entire life. Moonbeams dancing on the wall, starlight answers baby's call. Close your eyes and drift away. Dream until another day. Richard's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Those were Catherine's words, Catherine's melody, the song she'd created for Emma. In those precious months before cancer stole everything. No one else knew that lullaby. He'd never shared it, never written it down, never mentioned it to any of the nannies or staff. Margaret's voice carried the same tenderness Catherine's had, the same perfect pitch and timing. But there was something else in her tone, something that spoke of deep personal loss, of someone who understood the weight of singing someone else's lullaby. Sleep now, little star so bright, wrapped in dreams throughout the night. Angels watch. You from above, singing lullabies of love. The tears came without warning, hot and relentless, 3 years of suppressed grief pouring out in silent sobs. Richard pressed his hand to his mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but the emotion was too powerful to contain. This woman, this stranger, was giving his daughter something he'd been too broken to provide. She was keeping Catherine's memory alive, in the most beautiful, heart-breaking way possible. Margaret's voice grew softer as Emma's breathing deepened, the lullaby becoming barely more than a whisper. Rest your head and close your eyes underneath the starlit skies. Mama's love will keep you safe until morning shows her face. That final verse shattered something inside Richard. Catherine had added those words during her last week, when she could barely speak above a whisper. How could Margaret possibly know them? Unable to bear another moment, Richard turned and fled, his carefully controlled world spinning out of orbit. He made it to his study before the sobs overtook him completely. 37-year-old billionaire CEO reduced to a broken man grieving the wife he'd loved and lost. 20 minutes later, as his tears finally subsided, Richard heard a soft knock on his door. Margaret entered carrying a tea service, her movements careful and respectful. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple black dress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. "I thought you might need this," she said, quietly, setting the tray on his desk. Her eyes were kind but unreadable, giving no indication whether she'd seen him in the doorway. "Where did you learn that song?" Richard asked, his voice rough with emotion. Margaret's hand stilled on the tea service. For a moment she looked vulnerable, almost fragile. "It's a family lullaby," she said finally. "My mother used to sing it to me." The lie hung between them, delicate and obvious. Richard knew his wife's composition when he heard it, knew every note and phrase by heart, but something in Margaret's expression warned him not to push, not yet. Emma settled down beautifully. Margaret continued, pouring tea with steady hands. She just needed someone to sing to her. The gentle rebuke in her words wasn't lost on Richard. He accepted the cup of tea, noting how Margaret had prepared it exactly the way he liked it, despite never being told his preferences. "You're very perceptive," he said carefully. "It's my job to pay attention," Margaret replied. "Children need music, Mr. Blackwell. They need lullabies and love songs and silly rhymes. It's how they learn that the world can be beautiful." "And what if the person who's supposed to provide that can't?" The question slipped out before Richard could stop. It, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. Margaret met his gaze directly, her green eyes filled with understanding. "Then someone else steps in, until that person finds their voice again." That night, Richard stood outside Emma's nursery for the third time in 18 months. Through the crack in the door, he could see Margaret sitting in the rocking chair Catherine had chosen, holding Emma and humming softly. The scene was so reminiscent of his former life that it physically hurt to watch. But there was something different about Margaret's presence, something that didn't feel like replacement or substitution. She wasn't trying to be Catherine. She was simply offering love where love was needed. Over the following days, Richard found himself paying closer attention to the woman who'd somehow brought music back into his house. Margaret moved through her duties with quiet grace, but there were moments when he caught glimpses of something deeper. The way she touched the keys of Catherine's piano when she thought no one was looking, the poetry books that appeared in different locations throughout the house, the fact that she knew exactly how he liked his coffee, how Emma preferred her bottles warmed, how to avoid the creaky floorboard outside his office. Most importantly, she continued singing to Emma every night, always Catherine's lullaby, always, with the same loving attention that had moved Richard to tears that first afternoon. A week later, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of hiding in his study during Emma's bedtime routine, he approached the nursery and knocked softly on the doorframe. "May I join you?" he asked. Margaret looked up from where she sat with Emma, her expression carefully neutral. Of course, it's your home. Richard settled into the chair beside her, close enough to smell her subtle perfume, close enough to see the way Emma's tiny fingers curled around Margaret's thumb. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the baby's eyes grow heavy. "She has your eyes," Margaret said softly. "She has her mother's smile," Richard replied, then felt compelled to add, "Catherine died when Emma was 8 months old." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and there was genuine pain in her voice. "That must have been devastating." "It was. I haven't been much of a father since then." Margaret considered this for a moment. "Grief doesn't make us bad parents, Mr. Blackwell. It just makes us human." "Please," Richard said, surprising himself again. "Call me Richard." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, a softening around her eyes. "All right, Richard." The sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. They continued sitting together as Emma drifted towards sleep, and for the first time in 3 years, Richard felt something approaching peace. "Would you sing?" he asked quietly. "The lullaby?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment, then began the familiar melody. Her voice was clear and sweet, filling the nursery with the same magic Catherine had created years ago. But as Richard listened, he began to notice subtle differences in Margaret's interpretation. Where Catherine's version had been pure maternal love, Margaret's carried undertones of loss and longing that spoke to something deeper. When the song ended, Emma was fast asleep. Margaret stood carefully, settling the baby in her crib with practiced ease. Richard remained in his chair, unwilling to break the spell of the moment. "Margaret," he said as she prepared to leave, "how do you really know that lullaby?" She paused in the doorway, her back to him. When she finally turned around, there were tears in her eyes. "Because I used to sing it to my own daughter," she whispered, "before I lost her." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. Richard felt his heart clench with recognition, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over darkness. "What happened?" he asked gently. Margaret closed her eyes, gathering strength. "Car accident. She was 3. It's been 2 years, and I still wake up some nights thinking I hear her calling for me." The pieces suddenly fell into place, Margaret's natural way. With Emma, her understanding of grief, the depth of emotion in her voice when she sang. She wasn't just a housekeeper who happened to be good with children. She was a mother without a child, someone who understood loss in ways most people never would. "What was her name?" Richard asked. "Lily," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Lily Rose." "Tell me about her." For the next hour, sitting in Emma's nursery surrounded by the gentle light of the night lamp, Margaret shared stories of her daughter. Lily's laugh that sounded like wind chimes, her obsession with butterflies and fairy tales, the way she insisted on wearing her princess dress to the grocery store, the lullaby that had been passed down through Margaret's family for generations, the one she'd sung to Lily, every night until that terrible Tuesday when a drunk driver ran a red light and stole everything. Richard listened with the attention of someone who understood every nuance of devastating loss. He found himself sharing memories of Catherine in return, painting pictures of the brilliant, vibrant woman who'd filled their home with music and laughter. As they talked, something profound began to shift between them. They weren't employer and employee anymore, weren't even strangers sharing polite conversation. They were 2 broken people who'd found unexpected understanding in the darkness. "I came here because I couldn't bear to be around children anymore," Margaret admitted as the night grew deeper. "But when I saw the job posting for your household, something told me to apply. When I met Emma, when I saw how much she needed someone to sing to her..." She trailed off, unable to finish. "You're healing her," Richard said quietly. "Both of us, really." "Or maybe she's healing me," Margaret replied. Over the following weeks, their evening routine became sacred. Richard would join Margaret for Emma's bedtime, and they would sit together in the rocking chairs Catherine had chosen, sharing stories and comfortable silences while Emma drifted off to sleep. Margaret always sang the lullaby, and Richard found himself beginning to hum along, his voice joining hers in tentative harmony. Slowly, carefully, Richard began to reclaim his role as Emma's father. He started joining them for morning breakfast, reading bedtime stories, even attempting to change diapers despite his complete lack of experience. Margaret guided him with patient encouragement, never making him feel inadequate or rushing his progress. "She loves you," Margaret said one evening, watching Richard successfully soothe Emma after a minor fall. "She just needed you to come back to her." "I was afraid," Richard admitted. "Afraid that if I loved her too much, losing her would destroy me completely." "Love isn't a finite resource," Margaret said gently. "The more we give, the more we have to give." It was a lesson Richard was slowly learning to believe. As his relationship with Emma deepened, he found himself looking forward to their evening routine with Margaret. She had a way of making their broken little family feel whole again, filling the spaces Catherine's absence had left with her own unique warmth and wisdom. 1 month after that first afternoon when he'd caught her singing, Richard made another decision that would change everything. He knocked on Margaret's door late one evening, finding her reading poetry by lamplight. "I have something to show you," he said. He led her to his study, where Catherine's piano sat covered and untouched since her death. With trembling hands, Richard lifted the cover, revealing the keys that had once brought such joy to his house. "She composed that lullaby here," he said quietly. "The night before Emma was born. She said she wanted our daughter to have a song that belonged only to her." Margaret approached the piano reverently, her fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "It's beautiful." "Would you play it?" Richard asked. "I haven't heard it since." Understanding filled Margaret's eyes. She settled onto the piano bench, her posture graceful and confident. When she began to play, Richard realized she was classically trained, her technique flawless and expressive. The lullaby filled the room with bitter-sweet beauty, each note perfectly placed and lovingly rendered. As the melody swirled around them, Richard felt Catherine's presence in the room, not as a ghost haunting his grief, but as a blessing on this new chapter of his life. When Margaret's voice joined the piano, singing the words Catherine had written for their daughter, Richard finally understood what his wife had meant during those final days when she'd begged him to keep music alive in their home. "She would have loved you," Richard said when the song ended. "Catherine would have loved how you care for Emma." Margaret's hands stilled on the keys. "Do you think she would mind? That I'm here, singing her song to her daughter?" "I think she sent you," Richard said, the words surprising him with their certainty. "I think she knew Emma would need someone like you, and that I would too." That night marked another turning point in their unusual relationship. Richard began working shorter days, prioritizing time with Emma and Margaret over endless business meetings. He taught Emma to clap along when Margaret played piano, delighting in his daughter's giggles when she hit a particularly high note. Margaret, in turn, began sharing more of herself. She told Richard about her background as a music teacher, about the small apartment where she and Lily had lived, about the way grief had made her wander for 2 years before landing on his doorstep. She showed him pictures of Lily, a tiny girl with Margaret's golden hair and mischievous smile who looked remarkably like Emma. "Do you think they would have been friends?" Margaret asked one evening, studying the photograph. "I think they would have been sisters," Richard replied, and meant it. As autumn turned to winter, their household settled into a rhythm that felt remarkably like a real family. Emma took her first steps in the living room while Margaret played piano, and Richard cheered from his work-from-home setup. She said her first word, "Maggie," while sitting on Margaret's lap during breakfast, sending Richard into paroxysms of mock jealousy that made both women laugh. The outside world began to take notice of the changes in Richard Blackwell. Business colleagues commented on his improved mood, his willingness to leave meetings early for family time, the way he smiled when talking about his daughter. Some raised eyebrows about the beautiful woman who'd become such an integral part of his household, but Richard found he didn't care about gossip. For the first time since Catherine's death, he was truly living instead of simply surviving. Christmas approached with a warmth the Blackwell mansion hadn't experienced in years. Margaret decorated the house with tasteful elegance, including Emma in every decision and creating new traditions while honoring the memory of old ones. She convinced Richard to put up Catherine's favorite ornaments, telling him that love wasn't diminished by remembering it alongside new joy. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell outside and Emma played with her new toys, Richard realized he was facing a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Margaret's employment had been temporary, a stopgap solution that had somehow become permanent, but nothing had ever been officially discussed about the future, about what they were building together or where it might lead. That evening, after Emma was asleep and Margaret had finished her piano practice, Richard found her in the kitchen, making hot chocolate. She moved through the space like she belonged there, like she'd always been part of their lives. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd been thinking, "we need to talk." She turned to face him, and he saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They'd been dancing around their growing feelings for weeks, both afraid to name what was happening between them, both terrified of disrupting the fragile peace they'd created. "I know," she said softly. "I've been thinking the same thing." Tu'uek settled in the living room by the fireplace, the Christmas tree casting gentle shadows around them. For a moment, neither spoke, both aware they were standing at a crossroads that would change everything. "When I hired you," Richard began carefully, "I thought I was just getting help with housework. I never imagined that a broken housekeeper and a grieving widower could heal each other." Margaret finished with a gentle smile. "Something like that." Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "Margaret, what we have, what we've built with Emma, it's not just convenient or temporary anymore. At least not for me." "Nor for me," she admitted. But Richard, we're both still healing. We're both still learning how to live with our losses. I don't want either of us to confuse gratitude with something deeper. Is that what you think this is? Gratitude? Margaret studied his face in the firelight, seeing the man who'd emerged from his grief over the past months. No, she said finally. I think this is love, but I think it's complicated love, the kind that comes with ghosts and responsibilities, and a little girl who needs stability more than she needs romance. What if we could give her both? Richard asked. What if we could build something real together, something that honors where we've been while embracing where we're going? Before Margaret could answer, they heard Emma crying from her nursery. Without discussion, they both rose and walked upstairs together, their movements synchronized by months of shared routines. Emma had kicked off her blankets and was reaching toward the door, as if sensing her parents' voices. Richard lifted her gently while Margaret straightened the crib, and together they settled into the familiar ritual of soothing her back to sleep. But this time, when Margaret began to sing the lullaby, Richard joined her. His voice was rusty, from disuse, uncertain on some of the higher notes, but it blended with hers in a harmony that felt like coming home. Emma's eyes grew heavy as their combined voices filled the nursery with love and music and the promise of dreams worth having. Moonbeams dancing on the wall, starlight answers baby's call, they sang together, their voices growing stronger with each line, close your eyes and drift away, dream until another day. As the lullaby ended and Emma settled into peaceful sleep, Richard and Margaret remained close together, their daughter safe between them. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle glow of the night light and the promise of tomorrow, Richard finally understood what Catherine had been trying to tell him in those final weeks. Love wasn't about replacement or moving on. It was about opening your heart wide enough to hold everything, grief and joy, memory and hope, the past that shaped you and the future that called to you. Margaret hadn't erased Catherine's place in their lives. She'd simply made room for new, love to grow alongside the old. 6 months later, Richard Blackwell proposed to Margaret Evans in Emma's nursery, the place where their love had truly begun. Margaret said yes, through tears of joy and disbelief, and Emma clapped her hands as if she understood that their unusual family had just become official. They married the following spring in a small ceremony attended by close friends and colleagues, with Emma toddling down the aisle as their flower girl. Margaret wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet that included both roses for her lost lily and daisies for her new beginning. During their first dance, the orchestra played an arrangement of the lullaby that had brought them together. As they swayed to the familiar melody, Richard whispered in Margaret's ear, "Catherine would have loved this song as a wedding waltz." "I think she's dancing with us," Margaret whispered back, and Richard felt the truth of it in his bones. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of how a lullaby had saved their family. They would explain about her first mother, who had created the song with love and hope, and her second mother, who had carried that love forward when darkness threatened to consume them all. Emma would grow up knowing she was doubly blessed, doubly loved, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from voices joining together in harmony, creating something new while honoring what came before. And every night, in a house that had learned to sing again, 3 voices would blend, together in the lullaby that had started it all. Proof that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in unexpected packages. The melody that had once represented Richard's deepest grief became their family's greatest joy, a bridge between past and future, between loss and love, between the family that was and the family that would be. In the end, Margaret's arrival hadn't been chance or coincidence. It had been grace, pure and simple, the kind of miracle that happens when broken hearts are brave enough to let music back in, when grieving souls choose love over fear, and when a child's need for lullabies becomes the catalyst for a love story that transcends loss and creates something beautiful from the ashes of sorrow.